Good.
Over to you, Ken.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Welcome to the Franchise Company First Friday. Julie is on the call, but after some dental treatment yesterday, she's decided to delegate today's session. So hopefully you can be patient and put up with me. We're looking today at a really, really interesting topic in terms of secrets of scale and building and developing businesses using scaling strategies. We've managed to get Nick Empson to give our presentation today. Nick has a lot of experience with scaling and was with the Little Kickers franchise, and more recently has been taking on independent work, and that's how he and I connected, and I'm hoping that will certainly continue. So I'd like to hand over to Nick now, who's going to explain exactly how it should be done.
Sure. No, thanks, Ken. Appreciate the introduction. Let me just do a screen share here. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. Wonderful. Excellent. Okay. Well, firstly, good morning, everyone. And thank you all for taking the time to be here with me and listen to my journey and my story, and hopefully you'll gain some insights into how to successfully scale a franchise business. And there'll definitely be some takeaways for non-franchise business as well. I say good morning because I'm actually based in Canada. I've been in Canada since 2012, but all my family is back in the UK. I grew up in Reading. And so, yeah, I do get back to the UK several times a year, at least sort of 2 or 3 trips a year. But yeah, I'm actually based in rural Ontario right now. I'm about an hour and a half sort of northeast of the city of Toronto. So I will give you, let me just go through this. I'll give you a bit of an introduction here. I'm assuming everyone can still see those slides okay. I've just got the video on my screen here. Maybe I'll move it over here. There we go. So what I'm hoping to do today is just a quick sort of welcome and introduction to myself, giving you some insights into my background and my journey. I'll talk about sort of what does it actually mean when we're talking about scaling a business? And then most of the presentation, what I'm hoping to do is to share some tools, some practical thinking, and just some insights into how you can think about scaling your business and perhaps some takeaways that you can start to implement immediately. I've included a little section on tools and technology. AI is obviously at the forefront of a lot of people's minds at the moment, and as I go through the introduction, I can sort of talk about where I'm using AI currently in a couple of different places, and again, hopefully give you some insights and some practical tools into how AI is being used effectively, and how you can take it away and use it effectively in your business, hopefully from today. If you're not already using it, it's becoming a pretty important tool, I think, in all businesses. And then just a sort of a wrap up, talking about scaling with intention. So that's sort of the topics I hope to cover today. So just before we sort of get into the objectives, so who am I and why am I here talking to you today? I won't bore you with a long version of my story, but I'll try and give you the Cliff Notes version of where I began. And it's actually it's interesting. I was doing some reflecting, and so I'm turning 40 in August, and I've spent half my life in franchising, which was not intentional by any means. I sort of fell into franchising in my teens, I guess, is when it sort of started. I studied sports leadership in Reading University, wanted to do something sports related, but perhaps sort of on the managerial side. Completed my degree, and it was actually before I'd graduated that I came across this company called Little Kickers. And I'd already been doing sports coaching at the time, and Little Kickers provided me with the opportunity to do some coaching with them. And it was an age group, it was preschool, an age group that I'd never worked with before. So I didn't really think too far ahead. I was just like, this is going to be another string to my bow. This will look good on my resume. So I joined the company, and then actually not long after I met with the owners of the business, And before I even graduated, they had hired me at the head office level, and my role was essentially franchisee training and franchisee support. And so I was brought into the office and, sort of answering the phone, doing lots of customer administration, but I very quickly took ownership of the operating manual, building that out, learning it, and then delivering training. And then, as I say, the rest is history. I actually spent more than 15 years with Little Kickers. It was a long journey, and when I first joined, we were in just the one country with about a dozen or so unit franchises. And by the time I left in late 2020, I was the chief operating officer, managing a network of more than 330 units. Group turnover was more than 43 million Canadian. Yeah, and we were in more than 34 countries. So it was, as you can imagine, there's quite a journey within there, and it's always difficult, I think, when I talk to people about that sort of 15 plus year journey with that company in terms of all of the things that happened. That a lot can happen in 15 years, and that itself is quite a journey to go from just the one market. But honestly, I loved every minute of it. I had a really cool job. After the sort of the first year of employment with Little Kickers and working with them, I decided to kind of leave the employment side of things, and I actually ended up buying a unit franchise, and I ended up a multi-unit, but they kept me on as a consultant. And so I basically did all of the overseas training and support thereafter. And it was pretty much after the year after I joined, it was pretty much one country a year, pretty stably, every year after that. And then, as I said, sort of just worked my way up back to that sort of managerial level in 2012. They re-employed me, moved me over to Canada to continue the international growth of the business. And I was managing my units from overseas, which was pretty challenging whilst working in the head office role. Decided to sell my unit, so I successfully took my own businesses to a sale. And then towards the end of Little Kickers' time, when I was there, we actually were the owner decided to sell, and so we were actually taking that business to a sale as well. So there was a lot in there in terms of different stages of business development and growth and scaling, and how we went about doing that. And then there's this sort of additional element for me personally as a unit franchise, taking my business to a sale and then having the opportunity to work on the head office team side of things and put all of the things in place in order to maximize the value within that business and then ultimately take that business to a sale. Now, that the sales side is not necessarily the focus today, but there's a lot of tools and tricks in there that if you're looking to maximize the value and scaling, there are some things that you can do, and I'm hoping to share some of those insights with you today. So moving on to the objectives then for today. So what I hope to cover is understanding what scalability looks like, and obviously I'm putting this in a franchise context. Learning the systems, the tools, and some of the thinking frameworks, because honestly, a lot of this stuff is about mindset. And I sort of draw on some of my coaching experience and business coaching, talking about those thinking frameworks and mindset as ultimately as you guys as business owners will need to think about certain things and ask some pretty tough questions of yourself. And that's where, Ken and myself can help as well to challenge you in terms of thinking about things and perhaps things that you hadn't thought about before. So there'll be a few questions in here, perhaps some sort of lofty, big questions, but I'd like to guide you through that. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, really, I'd like to give a lot of practical ideas, insights, just in terms of improving the operation side of the business, how you get more franchisee engagement. And then at the end, I've just got a list of books. I'm a pretty avid reader, to be honest. And there's a whole host of business books that I can recommend on various topics. I've pretty much read most of them out there, or at least most of the good ones. But yeah, there's a list of tools and action points that you can work away with straight away today. Okay, so I'm going to start off then with just sort of talking about what is the difference between successful and scalable. And there is a key difference in here. So most people think because you've got a successful business, you can just start scaling it straight away, and that's not often the case. So success is essentially you've been running the business a number of years, and most businesses, they get to that sort of 3-year point where they've kind of figured things out, and now they're actually starting to make profit, make money in the business. So they're generating consistent profits. They've started to develop this loyal customer base. They're able to devalue their value proposition effectively. And generally it's sort of operationally sustainable in the day to day. But often the bottleneck becomes the owner of the business, and time becomes one of those resources that you need to start thinking about. How do you free up time? And then within that becomes delegation, and how do you delegate effectively? So that's what successful looks like, but success doesn't necessarily translate into scalable. So the real question then is, can you significantly grow your business without this linear increase in cost or complexity? And when you start to scale, there will be more complexities. And I'll go through, specifically in a franchise context, I'll go through what some of those complexities are. But essentially, when you start scaling, you need to make sure that you've got the systems and the structures in place that can support the expansion of the business. So we're not just sort of running, running successfully. We're now thinking about, okay, how would we fit more people into the business here? What operations, systems, oversight would we need in order to add more people in? You have to be able to replicate your value proposition across the networks and the markets that you're operating in, and then understand how that would be, how that would be applicable to other markets. Now, franchising is generally sort of set that way anyway, but as you think about expanding, and as I mentioned in the introduction, I have a lot of experience on the international side of things. You have to start thinking about how your model is replicatable in different markets where perhaps you don't have access to the same materials or resources or people or whatever it looks like in that market. And just on that, I'll give you an example of Subway. I spoke to, actually, I think it was a franchise development guy within the Subway network. I spoke to him a few months ago, and he was telling me the story about how they'd started to franchise in the Middle East, but Subway simply couldn't get the same type of flour to go in their subs that made them the way that they are, and so they actually had to abandon franchising in that market. But that's just one component that you would have to think about in terms of scaling out your business. So you often rely as well on processes, automation, and standardization. And I will talk a little bit about automation when I get to the tech slide. AI is definitely helping with this, but there are other tools, CRMs, which can really help you to automate your workflows. Okay, so scaling in franchising. Franchising sort of naturally offers you this ability to scale your business anyway. And there's definitely some leverage points within franchising, and it's people, capital, market, and scale. So when we're thinking about people, franchisees are the people that are investing their own time in this business and their own money and their energy to help you grow. And franchising, it's a very different journey from having an employee. And I've felt this sort of over the years, having employees and paying managers to run things versus having somebody who's actually committed. They're very much bought into the brand. They're ready and willing to invest their money and their time and energy into developing this business. So franchising from a scaling perspective is actually a great way of doing it. And people is one of those key leverages that we have in that model. So in terms of bringing the capital, as I've mentioned, franchisees will be the ones that are helping your expansion. And for most people in growth mode, particularly when you get to new markets, sorry, that little jingle is the dog ringing the bell to go out, but I'll continue on. When we talk about capital in markets, you don't have to fund the expansion in the market. You're charging an upfront fee, which means that you can use that money to reinvest into the growth and development. And if you are in that sort of growth stage, my recommendation is that every upfront fee that you're taking in should really be reinvested into the business to help you get the next unit and the next unit and the next unit. So there's a lot of money coming in through that franchise system. You have market leverage, and so you have local people on the ground delivering your product and service, but they understand the market, and so you don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel and train people to do things. They will pick up your service and product and be able to push it into the market, and that's perhaps a key point for later on. And then scale leverage. Once you've actually got all of the systems in place, and once you've kind of figured the model out and you've thought about how you would scale it, you can then start to develop these systems, and then it's just a simple case of, okay, we're going to add another unit, add another unit, add another unit, and build from there. But as with every business, increasing in size comes with increasing in complexity. So you have to have tighter systems. You have to really operationalize the business. And there's a lot of IT infrastructure that can help with that. But you need to have these tight systems in place. Otherwise, you start to lose things. Same with relationships. And Ken and I have talked about this a number of times. Relationships are one of the biggest and most important things in franchising. And of course, as you grow and as you scale, there's a lot more of them, and those need managing, and how you then support those people on their journeys, and how you manage that franchise relationship. And they're not employees, and they're not quite entrepreneurs. They're entrepreneurial, and it's a real sort of striking that balance between allowing them to be creative in the business, whilst having those systems and essentially maintaining that authority over what they can and can't do. As I've mentioned, the support demands also increase. So, as you grow, franchisees are going to need help with different things. They're going to need help with marketing, HR, technology side of things. And then on your side as well, with more people comes legal overheads. And it's just the nature of the business. Unfortunately, as you grow and as you scale, there's more opportunity and more chance for things to go wrong and to bring in the wrong people in the business, and then your legal overheads will inevitably increase. And especially in my experience, if you're looking at international franchising in terms of how you want to scale your business, the legal side is actually often the barrier to entry. There were certainly some markets that Little Kickers looked at, and it's going to cost like $50,000 just to get the franchise agreement in place. Well, that becomes a barrier to entry because no master franchise is going to help you fund that, and so it's prohibitive in terms of you entering that market. The other thing to note in terms of scaling here then is a lot of owners will be working, and I'll talk more about this in some of the tools, but a lot of owners will be working in the business, and you really need to make that shift to working on the business. So, and one step further than that, you're actually making the shift from doing the business to building the business that does the business, if that makes sense. So what you're trying to do now is build out this model that actually does the business, as opposed to you just delivering and doing the business yourself. So I'm just going to take a pause here as I put this big question up. So when we think about scaling, and I've talked about some of the mindset tools, if you were to think about your business today and say, if I had 100 more units tomorrow, would the current model survive it? And I think for the most part, the answer would probably be no. Perhaps yes in some cases, but it's probably going to be no. And then we have to start saying, okay, if I want to scale the business, I need to start thinking with the future in mind. I need to think about what that picture looks like. And then I need to start working backwards in terms of supporting 100 more unit franchises, terms of supporting more countries. That's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to suddenly go out and hire 10 support people or whatever that looks like for your business. It needs to happen gradually. But you need to also think about, what is my end game here? Where ideally would I like to be in X number of years? What does that look like? And then you can start working backwards and deliberately building the plan to actually start achieving that. Okay, just doing a quick time check here. I do tend to go quite quickly on these things, so please feel free as I sort of go through to pop questions in the chat, and I think we'll have a Q&A section at the end. So I'm going to get into some planning for scale then, and some tools in keeping with what I've just been saying, but some tools to actually help you think bigger. So the first one is reverse engineering a growth plan. And so I've used this with a number of clients now, and it's not necessarily to say, okay, you are going to sell the business. There's a couple of different ways you can use this tool, and this is just an example. So feel free to to sort of just take this as you will. But if you're thinking about the future, and it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, whatever that looks like, you can start by saying, well, either we want to sell the business for X. And there's a lot of, you can do some research into the average multiples. I've just picked out the average selling multiple of 3 times EBITDA, but that will depend on your business, but it also depend on the industry. So there's a couple of things there that impact your multiple of EBITDA. One of them is within your control. It's the things that you can put into your business to drive the value. And then there's a couple that are sort of out of your control, which is, you know, external conditions of, can you find a strategic buyer? You know, are you too niche for that to happen? You know, mergers and acquisitions will increase the value in the business. That's the route that Little Kickers went down. And yeah, and can you find that strategic buyer to actually help increase that? And if you can't, you know, perhaps your industry is just one of those industries where the multiples are a little bit lower. But there are things there that's within your control. So if we start breaking this down, then it's always good to work with the end in mind. Where would I like to be, and whether this is a revenue number or whether this is I'd like to sell for £5 million in 5 years. You can then just start working backwards and saying, okay, well, if I want to sell for 5 million and the multiple is 3 times EBITDA, that means I need to be making 1.6 million in the business. And then I've just done some simple calculations on here to say, you know, okay, well, if your average management fees that you're bringing in is 20,000, and that could just be baseline management fees, might not include things like merchandise and other little bits around the edges. But if your baseline royalty coming in is 20,000, your spend on that is 10,000. So actually your net management service fees coming into the business is 10,000. Well, then how many units would you need to get to your 1.6 million? And it's 167 units. But what you've essentially done now by using this tool, and of course this will look very different, you know, for other businesses, but what you've done is you've now reversed engineered your plan to say, okay, I'm taking a step back, I'm zooming out, where do I want to be? Okay, what does that actually look like? And for some of you, it might be quite surprising. You might be a lot closer to that goal than you think you are at this point in time. And perhaps you don't need as many units. Perhaps you need to focus on increasing your net management service fee per franchise. So there's a number of outcomes from doing this tool, and honestly some revelations in terms of different areas you can focus on. And certainly when we did a bit of this exercise within Little Kickers, you know, we found that we were actually a lot closer to our goal than we thought in terms of group revenues and where we were going. But we went on about a two-year strategic plan to focus on several key areas in the business to increase the multiple of EBITDA. And then we basically went for a number, and that was it. For 2 years, we were doing things in the business that not only focused on franchisee performance, keeping the franchisees happy in terms of increasing their profitability as well as our revenues. But there was a number of initiatives all around that just really increased the value in the business. But this is a really good place to start. Start with the end in mind, and then start reverse engineering backwards and see what it looks like in terms of the actual number of units that you need. And that might then determine, well, how many countries you're going to target, or maybe you don't target any countries at all. Maybe after you've done this exercise and you know the scope and the ceiling of your own market, you might say, you know what, the UK, I could sell 200 franchises. So actually this, you know, might elicit some things that you hadn't really thought about previously. Okay, so I'll just let this sit for a second while I take a sip here. So what's your end game? It's another one of those sort of coaching tools, I guess, getting clients to think about ultimately where you want to be. And in keeping what I've just been saying, I'm big on business planning, but I like to say I'm pretty lazy, and maybe it's not laziness, maybe it's just efficiency. The days of the 15, 20-page business plan are gone. And now we use more things like a business canvas. It's a much more practical tool. And what you're looking at the moment is essentially a very condensed business plan, which you can take away and use to help you map out the future, the medium term, and the short term. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So in terms of business planning, there's a few key things that need to be done. The first one is most businesses now have their core values outlined, but there's some real sort of practical things around core values within the business that you can do to actually make them come alive and be useful. So a lot of companies, and I've seen this a lot with big banks, you know, they're especially big banks, not naming any, but you know, their slogans and their values are like honesty, integrity, and you know, customer centric, and you're just like, yeah, that doesn't, as a customer, you don't feel those values. So it's one thing just to have a series of core values listed out for your organization, but it's another thing to actually live, breathe them, and track them, and build key performance indicators that measure things like values and measure things like customer satisfaction. And we can talk about some of those tools as we go through. But a starting point on a business plan, it's really important to know who are you as a company? What are the values that you exhibit in the business? And then making sure, and this is sort of part of the scaling piece and getting more people in, you need to make sure that at every point you're bringing in the right people into the organization. And values is one of those key drivers to bring the right people in. And there's a lot of talk these days about having a values-driven business. Well, what does that really look like? It looks like speaking into your values, knowing what they are, communicating your values, and then you will start attracting the right people. And Little Kickers was pretty key on its values early on. The tagline for the business was "Play Not Push," and the whole meaning behind "Play Not Push" was this idea that at the child level, we are going to basically be creating a play, fun-based education program. We're not pushing kids to be the next Rooney and the next Beckham, which really differentiated us from, one of our other competitors, who essentially was kind of the opposite. They were, we are proper training, we are the academy style football classes, to get kids to that next level. And I think by speaking into those values, by using it in your marketing materials, you start attracting the right people. And that's ultimately when I first came across Little Kickers, that was the thing that attracted me to the business. Having grown up in the UK, PE system, I studied sports at school, I did PE, and it was always about who's the best athlete, who wants to, who wants to compete and go on. And of course, it's such a competitive space that it's the small minority that actually end up, if you're lucky enough not to get injured, you end up in the space. And so I really didn't like this onus on my grades were dependent on me being the best athlete I possibly could be, when I think we should all have access to exercise and fitness and sports, and that community side. And that's what Little Kickers was all about. So by them exhibiting their values, they started to attract not just the right customer base, but the right people in the organization. And that is one of the keys to scaling, is you need the right people who are bought into your values, who will then help you to grow the business. Moving on, understanding your why, your purpose, your passion, and why your business exists. And there's a really great book by Simon Sinek called Starts With Why, where he essentially talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And so by outlining and understanding what your why is, you can then actually start to speak into this again in your marketing, and combined with having the right people in the business. Your why is your sort of everlasting, this is the reason why our business exists. And that's what people are buying into. And no matter what we do, how we deliver it, so your how is sort of separate from that, our why never changes. And it might sort of change over the years. And with Little Kickers, they sort of dabbled in other products, like, they did birthday parties and holiday camps and, classes. And then there was a little bit of rugby thrown in and perhaps some dance stuff. So that the how, what you specialize in being or doing can change, but your why doesn't change over time. So there's a couple of sort of key things there to kick off the business plan. And then we get into your long-term target. So again, I'm big on sort of either exit strategy or start with the end in mind. And this is really important for scaling. Zoom out 10 years. Where do you want to be? Where do you want the business to be? And then capture that, if you can, as a single numerical, they call it the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal. Capture that as a single numerical, whether it's a revenue target or whether it's a values-driven target, such as impact to the community, hours delivered, or whatever that looks like for your business. It's really good to know what that looks like. And so the Little Kickers one, I think, was a number of participants, something like 1 million, 1 million children over the course of the years in the business. So it's important to sort of zoom out and be like, where do I want to be long term? And then what we do with that vision, that long-term vision here and that target, is we break that down and we say, okay, well, if that's 10 years, let's start to map that out. If that's 10 years, what does 3 years look like? And then now we start to put some numbers on it. What's our turnover going to be in 3 years if we were to achieve that target? What's our profit going to be? And so we're almost doing a little bit on the coaching piece here, where we're doing some vision building, some dream building, and we don't really know what 10 years looks like. And 3 years is still quite far out as well. So we're going to set some lofty goals. We're going to think bigger, set some big targets, because linked to bringing the right people in, it's your long-term target, and that excitement around that. It should be pretty scary as well, but that's what's going to bring people into the business. When you start thinking bigger as a leader in the organization, that's where you're going to start to see the scale, because now you're already in the mindset of this is where we're going to. We now have a destination and that's what we're heading for. And it's scary, but it's exciting. And I want to bring a whole bunch of people with me who are also on the same values of the business, but are also bought into that long-term target of that's exciting. 1 million kids. Wow. I want to be a part of that journey. So there's something in there within shooting for the stars, bringing it back down to 3 years and saying, let's look at it a little bit more practically now. And the vision is, let's think about what does it feel like? If I'm 3 years from now, what does that journey actually feel like? And then we take that 3-year plan and we break it down into a 1-year plan. And we say, okay, a year from now, if that's 10 years, if that's 3 years, now what's 1 year? Okay, let's put turnover, profit, and let's actually start to track some of these things now. We're going to put those KPIs, the key performance indicators, in to help us measure the success and the milestones that we need to hit along the way. And then we set a series of SMART goals. And if you're not familiar with SMART, which I guess most people are these days, it's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-based. And a lot of people struggle when setting goals because they're very good at setting the sort of the end goal, but they're not particularly good at setting the means goals. And there's a real difference in that. The end goal is the sort of the big lofty, well, I want to, I want to get fit, for example. So I've just started going to the gym again. And so my end goal is, well, I want to improve my health and fitness. But what are the means goals? Like how do I actually do that? And what measurables can I put in place? So for me, it's okay, I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week. That's a simple, SMART goal that I can check off and say, well, did I do that or didn't I do that? And then within that, I can say, well, instead of just saying I want to get fit, I can say I want to run, a kilometer at the gym, or I want to deadlift, 135 pounds or whatever that looks like. You can start to break down those means goals to help you achieve the end goals. But that, in essence, is a very condensed business plan. The only other thing I think I would say about this at this point in time is that getting buy-in from teams is really, really important, and sharing this across the organization, not just with your management team, but with all employees, all franchisees, and perhaps to some extent customers. You don't necessarily have to put sort of the details and the turnover and profit, but values certainly should be on your websites. When you talk about your why, this should be the very fabric of all of your marketing materials. So there's a way that you can use this very effectively, practically across the business, but certainly on an internal perspective. If you share this business plan with the entire organization, immediately what you've done is you've told everybody what the goals are, where you want to be, and now you're helping people get focused on making sure that what they're working on is actually in line with the big picture for the business. Okay, so just keep an eye on time here as well. So in terms of some other tools then to support growth, so rocks, KPIs, dashboards, and scorecards. It's a great analogy. You can sort of watch the analogy of the rocks as a YouTube video, but I'll give you a very quick demonstration now. The idea with rocks is that if you imagine you have an empty jar, which represents your time, and then you have all of these things that need to get done in the business. And typically the way most businesses operate, and a lot of owners get stuck in this trap as well, is you just get sucked into the day-to-day. And so your time is a key resource. And if you have this empty jar, and if you were to say that the nitty-gritty admin tasks are the sand and the water, what happens is, for the most part, they go in the jar first. Those are the bit, you wake up, you're doing emails already, da-da-da. Then if you think about pebbles, which are sort of important projects that need to get done, but they're not the most important things, but they are projects that need to get done. Well, they then go in the jar next. And what you find is the most important things, the rocks, the most important things that you need to get done to move the entire business forward, get left behind. And if you do it in that way, they don't fit in the jar. And so you find yourself running out of time. Now, the idea with having the business plan and the focus and the rock structure is to completely flip that on its head and say, okay, what if we have a structure in place where rocks are the first thing that we focus on? We don't get up in the morning and we check emails, we check rocks, and then we plan out what we need to do. So the rocks are the big key projects that are going to move the business forward that quarter. And if we put those in the jar first, because that's what we're focusing on, then we put the pebbles in, and the admin stuff has to get done anyway. So it's just kind of part of the normal day-to-day. So if we put in the sand and the water in last, you find that everything fits in the jar nicely. So that's the analogy of the rocks. And essentially, you can implement that structure in your business to help everybody get in alignment once you've shared the business plan, to help teams that may be siloed at the moment. You can bring them all together, and then you can allocate rocks, and every team member can have sort of between 3 to 7 rocks per quarter. So now, instead of everybody just working on sort of day to day and really they're not focused on let's move the business forward. Once you change that mindset and you get everybody focused on rocks and you set smart rocks, so now we have specific goals. By the end of the quarter, you can look back and see how much more you've achieved in that first quarter that you do this compared to every other quarter that has gone before that. To help you attain the rocks, KPIs, dashboards, and scorecards, these are really the numbers and some of the nitty-gritty numbers that you need to know. And it's even now, it's sort of surprising to me when I've worked with clients and how many businesses don't have a really good handle on, on not just the numbers, but what numbers actually matter the most. And that really depends on where you're headed and the outcomes too. But it's really important to know your numbers in the business. And to know which ones are the most important ones. And they'll be different for different levels of the business. I mean, Net Promoter Score, for example, might be a really important one at perhaps even employee level, but at customer level, to get a real handle on, how are my customers actually feeling, particularly in a franchise system where you might not necessarily be able to do site visits on a regular basis, but you need the data daily or at least, sort of monthly at best. So how do you get that data in? So things like Net Promoter Score can really help you understand that. And then the setting the KPIs, so those measurables, so we're actually understanding, where we're currently at versus where we want to be. You can set some milestones and then start working towards those. And then there's dashboards and scorecards. Now, most people sort of use this term interchangeably, but there is a kind of a subtle difference. So in Little Kickers, we'd actually started to map out different dashboards for each area of the business. So there's like a marketing dashboard because there's so many nuanced things within marketing. You've got your social sites, you've got your SEO, you've got perhaps some word of mouth or some physical marketing. So there's all sorts of different things that you can start tracking to understand at a high level, okay, how many leads did we get in and what sales did we convert? And so you've got sales and marketing dashboards, but you might have an operations dashboard, which is effectiveness in the business and efficiency. And did we get this done in time? Or, how many of the staff are trained correctly? How many have been onboarded and they've completed their onboarding training? And then you can start measuring things like operational effectiveness. Once a franchisee has gone through their training and complete, how do they hit the ground in their first 3 to 6 months? Use dashboards to measure out those things. The scorecard is a little bit different. The scorecard is kind of linked back to that business plan and the management team. And essentially, the scorecard is, the analogy I was given for this was if you imagine that you were on a desert island or you're enjoying a nice vacation, and you needed to look at the business from a high level perspective and understand in 5 numbers what would get you off of that beach and on the phone or to take immediate action in the business. So it's almost like a red flag early warning system. Your scorecard is a management tool where you can look at the numbers on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, whatever the cadence suits your business is, but look at those numbers and say, something is wrong here. We need to fix that like immediately. Dashboards give you more of an indication generally as to sort of overall performance looking backwards, and you can do some forecasting, but scorecard is more of a very quick management tool. I need to know the 5 numbers that are really important for the business. And if one of those numbers is off, I need to do something immediately and take action in the business. And then the quote at the end here, which I really like, is what gets measured gets done. And that's a Peter Drucker. Okay, so in terms of tools, then, just before I move on to the next section. So meeting rhythms is really important. Making sure that you have a regular meeting, and this sort of ties back into that business plan. Setting quarterly rocks for your business is really effective, and getting into a rhythm of we have a management team meeting. Whoever's on your staff, we have that meeting, we go over the business plan, we work on it together. You can work with your teams and allow them to come up with their own rocks and projects for the quarter based on the vision and that business plan that we've gone over. And then get into a quarterly rhythm. So every quarter we reset, and human beings are, there's a lot of studies around this, but we work effectively in these 90-day cycles. So you have a quarterly cycle where you work on the rocks, you get to the end of the quarter and you say, what did we accomplish? And it's not necessarily to criticize if people haven't done it, but you ask where the learning was. If we didn't accomplish sort of 80% of our rocks this quarter, if it was sort of 10%, well, okay, why? Maybe we set too many or they were too big. So there's some learnings within that quarterly cycle, but it realigns the management team to revisit the business plan. So instead of just saying, great, we've got a business plan and it's in the drawer or it's in my head and it's not shared with everybody, what you're doing now is on a quarterly basis, you're bringing that business plan out and it's only a 2-pager, but you're reestablishing the vision, the direction that you're going in, just getting everybody realigned and then moving forward with quarterly rocks. I would also recommend, if you have management teams, strongly recommend a weekly management team meeting where you go over things like check in, how's everybody getting on in the business? And this doesn't have to be, sort of hours and hours. I know meetings can drag on sometimes, but you can do a very effective management team check-in about an hour and a half a week. And essentially the outcomes of this meeting are check in with your team, how are they doing? What rocks have they got on the go and are they stuck? Or are they just working on them and they're good? If they're stuck on anything, well, let's discuss it. Let's make sure there's this touch point opportunity that if you have a big project and it's a rock, which means we've identified it's one of the key drivers of business this quarter and you're stuck on it, well, that's something we need to talk about. So let's bring it into a discussion. Let's resolve the issues and then let's move forward. So check in with the team, review the rocks, take a look at the scorecard. How is the business performing? Is there anything urgent that we need to deal with? And if all of those things are looking good, if everything is sort of moving in the right direction, all of the rocks are looking good, then you just get into problem solving. So spend, half an hour, 45 minutes on what are the key issues that we're facing in the business? What is the root cause of that issue? And then how do we solve it? And this is really categorizing things in buckets. But by doing this meeting structure, you make sure that nothing falls through the cracks. So a lot of the time, things just happen. They pop up here, there, and everywhere, and there's lists and to-do lists. But really what we want to do here is we want to have that collective meeting with the management team to say, what are your biggest challenges? What is the root cause of that issue? And then there's normally a resolution. And the resolution is, it's a big project. We need to redo a technology piece in the business. Okay, is it important enough that we focus on that this quarter? Or do we need to focus on that later on? And so you could just come up with a couple of lists. You've got your current rocks for the quarter, and then you've got your future list of rocks. So now we've got those in buckets. Or perhaps it's a quick fix. You know what? I just need to phone so-and-so, or I just need to send an email out. Okay, capture it, add it to the to-do list, and then move on to the next issues. But having that weekly cadence with your management team in conjunction with going through the business plan, getting everybody on rocks, means now that everybody is pulled in alignment and everybody is basically working together towards the same goals. And that is a very effective way to help you scale your business. Okay, so I'm going to change gears a little bit here and talk a bit more specifically about network management and essentially how you can sort of work with franchises and some key insights into, to actually growing the current network and then helping you to sort of bring more people on board. So the first thing I want to go through is really, this is hopefully is a reminder for a lot of people. And I think it actually wasn't until a number of years in the business that I came across this, but you can actually work within the phases of the franchisee life cycle. Once you understand the phases and you can kind of pinpoint where people are at, then you can start focusing on, okay, how do we help people in the different phases and what other things that we can do at a franchisor level that really helps people. So the franchisee life cycle, it was sort of described to me a number of years ago, is very similar to that of a human life cycle. So you have your sort of, in franchising, introduction, they start off new. There's a lot of curiosity, a lot of excitement, but they also need a lot of hand-holding. New franchisees are very dependent. And so part of that scaling piece is to say, what systems and support mechanisms can we put in place just to help them hit the ground running? If there's automations or workflows, or there's a lot of online training platforms, and I'm not suggesting removing the human element from that, because relationships, as I've said, are one of the most important things in franchising. But are there things that you can do to help your franchisees hit the ground running and save time, make efficiencies? So again, as you scale and you think about, okay, we need to bring in that next 100 people, what does 10 looks like? Well, there's no way I could train, another 10 units, in the next quarter. So think about those systems that you can put in place to help them hit the ground running there. Then you get into sort of the growth phase, and a lot of time this is equated to that of the sort of the teenage phase. You get franchisees who, they've been around maybe a year, couple of years now, depending on the maturity of I guess the rest of the network and how quickly they learn and grow things. But they get into this phase where they kind of think they know it all, and they don't need you anymore, and they start pushing back on things and new initiatives that you implement. They're just everything that you're thinking, yeah, that could be great. They just push back on. And that's perfectly normal in franchising. So you get this sort of phase of the teenage phase. And then hopefully, after they've sort of gone through those humps and they realize, that actually you're on their side and you're all in this together, then they enter maturity. And honestly, this is, if you can get franchisees to this space as quickly as possible and for as long as possible, you'll have a more harmonious network. And that's obviously not always the case, but that's the aim. It's to determine when they're in maturity and just to help them stay in that mature phase for as long as possible. And then, of course, the end of the life cycle here is either, the business sort of drops off and they decline or they exit. So there's a pretty good tool in terms of managing how we deal with these with this life cycle. And what we do is we put them into buckets. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the sort of the 20 60 20 rule. And really the focus here is on managing the middle. So inevitably what happens is you have your bottom 20%, and again, the KPIs and the metrics that you build in the business will really help you to determine what does the actual bottom 20% look like. And if let's say it's a revenue target, for example, franchisees in their first year, I mean, they're all going to be in the bottom 20%. So you kind of almost need to discount. We're talking about once we've got an established network, you can almost put this on a spreadsheet and say, okay, let's just map them all out, revenue or whatever it looks like in terms of your KPIs. What are the most important measurables? And then look at who is the bottom 20%, who's the middle 60, and who's the top. And if you've got a bunch of I'd say, mature, sort of longer standing franchisees, perhaps they're past the 5-year mark and they're dropped off into the bottom 20%. I think we've got a bit of a problem here. So the way that we tackle this is your top 20% is your high performers. These are your self-starters. They should be fully engaged in the business. Typically, they're the ones that buy multiple territories, work really well with you on growth. These guys should be in your franchise council and should be working alongside you to sort of help you grow the business. They get it, they live the brand, and they outperform expectations. The middle 60% is your solid performers. And there'll be a spectrum within this, but typically they do well. They're influenced by other people though. And so this is where you can leverage some of the top to help you with mentorship and things like that. But your middle 60 are generally malleable, open to learning new things, and aspire to what the top 20% are doing. The bottom 20%, sort of not really including those new franchisees who are just on that growth trajectory. Typically, these people they're struggling. For whatever reason, they're struggling. Typically, they're disengaged at this point, or perhaps they're just simply not a good fit. And I think there's a lot of examples, particularly around the COVID era and even outside of COVID, but where you get the franchisees, they're really gung-ho. Perhaps they don't quite perform as well as they think they're going to, or it's just not meeting their expectations. And so they go off and get themselves a job. And that's when the performance suffers. And in my time, I mean, one of the things that I've noticed in terms of performance is essentially it's those people who don't put the time and the energy into the business. So what do we do with these people? Unfortunately, as bad as it sounds, we should be focusing on helping these people to exit. And I'm always in favor of helping people to exit well, which means sale or, at least allowing them to walk away with something that they are happy with. Often this is where you get some tension points as well. But helping these people to exit, and really the focus should be on the middle 60%. And why do we focus on the middle 60? Well, as I've mentioned, because they're malleable. They are influenced by the environment and by leadership in the business. They do set the tone and the cultural norm for the rest of the business, and they do drive replicability in the business. So really, when we talk about operationalizing your business and thinking about how we're going to scale and how we're going to grow this thing, look at the middle 60 in terms of what can we operationalize, what can we systemize, whether that's through technology or whatever that looks like. What can we do to help that middle 60% to continue to grow towards that top 20%? And then just quickly on those ones. So as I said, manage out the bottom 20%. you are recognizing and modeling what the top 20% are doing, and then systemizing for that middle portion. Okay, so I'm just keeping an eye on time here, and I'm going to whiz through a couple of these sections. Maybe this one is just to sort of take a screenshot. There's a really great book which is called Measure What Matters, and I've just thrown up some metrics that, just some ideas of things that you can think about measuring in terms of KPIs in the business. And really, they're in different buckets. So you've got like unit franchise economics. What is the health and the performance of your current network? Revenue, profitability, what are their customer acquisition costs, the customer lifetime value, etc., and any values or impact metrics. And sorry, that's your unit economics in terms of how they're operating, and then that's a single unit. And then when we talk about franchise network health, we're then looking at, okay, what's the average revenue per unit, the royalty revenue, the percent or the number of franchisees that are actually meeting their targets, and franchisee satisfaction fits into that as well. That's a really important measure. On the customer side of things, retention, churn rate, net promoter score, which I've mentioned, customer lifetime value, and then things like complaints and refunds. And again, just sort of zooming out in terms of scaling, if you don't have a system that can help you to manage and measure these things, then you're probably not primed yet to scale your business, and that's something to think about. And then, of course, growth metrics, when we're thinking about bringing new business in, new franchises, leads generated, conversion rate, how many new units have you opened, franchise revenues, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to sort of whiz through just so I can fit in the technology, and then I guess there'll be a couple of minutes here left over for those of you who have time. Just some key insights from franchising in generally. So the first one is franchisees are not employees and they're not entrepreneurs. They're not family, they're not friends, but you do need to be their biggest advocate. And one of the real insights that I've sort of had over my time, 20 odd years now in franchising, ingenuity comes from the ground up. And the real trick as a franchisor is that balance between enforcing conformity whilst allowing creativity. And really that top 20%, that's where a lot of your ingenuity, although it does come from everywhere, but that's where a lot of the ingenuity is going to come from. And that's why things like a franchise advisory council are really important, because you can leverage those top performing franchisees to help you to implement the things that are going to help you grow the business going forward. Okay, so super quick then, and kind of run out of time to get into this in any depth, but I will say a couple of things. The first one is, if you're not using AI in the business, you should, and figure out how to use it. I'm not saying use it for the sake of using it. I think a year ago or so now, I would have said, it's kind of new and, just wait and see, because there's a lot of hype and early adopters. Now we're another year on, and if you're not using it, you are going to get left behind. So figure out how to use it, and I can give you a couple of insights into that. But honestly, with things like Google Gemini, you don't need to write emails anymore. You can save a lot of those administration tasks by just putting into the prompt. It'll read the email that's been sent to you, and you can just put in a prompt to say, respond to this, and it writes it for you. ChatGPT is the same. I was on a call with a client last night, and they were talking about how they'd had a customer and there was kind of a bit of threat of legal action, but they were like, I just don't have the time to manage this. It's like 100 emails. How do I even respond to this? The answer, ChatGPT. You PDF all of those emails or you capture them, you throw them in ChatGPT and you say, you're an expert in legal, and don't use it as a lawyer, in place of a lawyer, but you can tell ChatGPT things like, you are an expert in marketing with 20 years experience, and then it can give you the answers based on the prompt that you've given it. But certainly what it's really good at is automation and processing and taking large chunks of data, like 100 email chain, and pulling out the most important things and then helping you to draft a response in a certain way. That's just a couple of ways. Content creation, it does pictures. There's a whole bunch of stuff now coming out on imagery, video, that is just really effective. Marketing, there's a platform called MyMarky, MyMarky, which essentially generates all of your socials, including imagery and text, for various platforms, Facebook, Instagram. Don't know if it does TikTok yet, but there are so many of these AI tools that are coming out now. It can be a little bit overwhelming when you start thinking about, what is there and how do I use it? I've signed up to a newsletter. It's called Superhuman. They do a daily sort of digest, but they tell you all of the, every day there's like 5 tools to help you improve productivity. So just on the AI side of things, my strong advice is if you're not using it, look at it, figure out how you can use it, because honestly, in my opinion now, those companies that are using it are going to start to see exponential growth. Versus those who are not, who are, I think, are going to start to stagnate. That's the big one. And then in terms of other systems that are available, and I've thrown Zoom on here. I mean, Zoom has come a long way in the last few years as well. But in terms of how we do recordings in the business, in terms of a franchise looking at, how do we deal with client care or support meetings with franchisees? Record every single meeting. If you have a coach or a franchise support person, get them to record every single interaction with one franchisee, all franchisees. You can then transcribe that and you can throw that into ChatGPT and say, okay, I'm coaching these franchisees. You've got the transcript. Where are my blind spots? What am I missing here? You can use ChatGPT as a coach or a mentor and really start to pull out these things like, okay, where are the gaps? What am I not focusing on? Or this was a really difficult conversation with the franchisee. You've got the transcript. How would I move forward from this? And pretty much in my daily life now, if I have a question about anything, ChatGPT is my go-to. And I'm not saying, because I think to an extent it takes the human element out, and that's not what I'm suggesting. I think the real key thing with AI is maintaining the humanity in that and using it, how we use it to enhance our own performance and using it as a research tool or whatever. But for me, for the most part now, ChatGPT is my go-to when I have questions because it gives me a high-level overview. And then I can zoom in and say, I don't like what you've said there, but I do like this bit. But you can also use it as self-reflection. What am I missing in myself? So there's a couple of tips there on Zoom and ChatGPT and some of the AI stuff. The other ones I've thrown up here, CRMs, especially for franchise sales, but certainly in terms of managing your own customer database and housing all the data. I think everybody in franchising looking to scale should be using a CRM, whether it's Zoho or HubSpot or the Salesforces of the world. And then in terms of performance management tools, going back to Rocks and having visibility in terms of all the projects that are on the go in the business. Monday is a really great system for this. Trello is a pretty good system for this, where you can actually give all of your teams access and you can have then clear oversight, particularly as you start growing. And perhaps now you've got different departments. You've got your marketing department over here, your finance department over here, operations here. They can each have their own Monday board with all of their Rocks and their goals listed on. And then you, as the manager or the owner of the business, you now have complete oversight into what everybody is doing, and it really helps you with that quarterly check-in or that weekly cadence meeting. I'm aware that I am now up in terms of time, so I am going to stop talking. I'm going to leave that slide on the screen. Just in terms of some final thoughts and tools, these are some great resources. The E-Myth, it's a golden oldie, talking about operationalizing your business. Traction and scaling up. A lot of the tools that I've talked about are in there, business planning tools, the Rocks, but these are books that will really help you to understand how to scale. Again, my experience, it's often helpful if you have somebody who helps you to implement in this business with experience. I've seen organizations that have just read the book and tried it and it hasn't really worked. Measure What Matters by John Doerr, and then I talked about Start With Why with Simon Sinek. These are some great resources. And then the final thought in here is thinking about scaling and thinking about where you want to be. Make yourself the least important person in the business. And if you are currently doing everything in the business, think about how, if you were to step away, what would you need to operationalize, systemize? Who would you need to hire? Who would you need to bring in to make yourself the least important person in the business? And that is really critical when thinking about scaling. And I'm going to stop talking.
Okay, Nick, that was fascinating. Thanks very much. Julie, I don't know whether the job of hosting this time's easier or harder because we're up for time. I don't know whether you want to add anything in for questions, but there's just a couple of things I need to mention. First of all, the next First Friday session will be the 1st of August with Jen Boffin from the BFA, who's going to be talking about well-being. There's a QR code up there that you can use, please. And a quick thanks again to Nick for a really interesting and fascinating subject. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Julie, do we want to maybe take some questions or not? Do you think we should?
Yeah, that's fine. I think if everyone can just click on the QR code and take 30 seconds to do the feedback, and then, then we can move to, if people want to stay on and ask any hot questions. I think there was loads and loads and loads of really great information. So yeah, Nick, thank you very much. It was pretty awe-inspiring. But yeah, if people want to stay on, we can take some questions from the Zoom, no problem at all.
I was telling Nick just very quickly last week, my early days with franchising were with Prontoprint, and I can remember when Edwin Thirlwell, who owned the business, told us that he wanted to open 150 shops in 3 years. We actually achieved 140, and that led in the early 80s to a flotation in 85. So it definitely can be done.
I
And
think
we're here to help.
the other interesting point, going back to the Prontoprint days, Ken and Nick, the point that you were making, Nick, about Subway in the Middle East, and they couldn't do it because they couldn't get the flour right. And again, it's almost, how can something as fundamental as that be missed? But actually, going back to Prontoprint, they had a new concept called Fudge Kitchen.
Yeah.
And I literally was like 21, 22 years old, completely green, fresh behind the ears out of university. And the day they opened Fudge Kitchen in the
Howden
Elton
Square.
Square,
Yeah.
after using shop fitters, designers, developers, you name it, the day they opened it, all the fudge melted because the lamps, the lights that they'd used and spec'd were too hot. So the whole lot melted in the middle of Eldon Square. And about 3 weeks later, the whole business was operating on the sale of ice creams because Edwin Thirlwell had come from Mr. Whippy. No one bought and again, the fudge was horrible. They kept bringing samples around on a Friday afternoon, and the fudge was horrible. But at the time, it was like, well, does that matter? But obviously, it did, and the business survived for a while in the sale of ice cream. So I think that's really significant to people involved in franchising, if you like, who haven't had that insight, for want of a better word, in terms of corporate life. And in terms of a small franchise or business owner, it's easy to look at the big boys and think they've got the resources, they've got the knowledge, they've got the expertise. But if you're small and if you are clever and if you use your resources effectively, and again, in terms of teams, I always used to say, like, don't worry about the rest because we're the best. And that's we believed in it, but we were, and we worked hard at it. So don't worry about what they're doing. We're aware of it. We know about it, but we're not going to get hung up on it. We're going to focus on what we've got to do. And we believe that we're the best and we'll get there to achieve what we want. So again, in terms of like small business franchisors, I just think that's a great kind of example of how the big boys do get it wrong.
And just tying that back into the business plan that I talked about, you've got your why and then you've got your how. Well, essentially your how is your niche. And that is exactly that. It's zooming in to say, well, instead of doing 10 things, what do we do one thing really, really well at? What can we be the best in the world at? And let's focus on doing that. And let's shut off all the other noise in terms of, other products and services, because a lot of business is about not just saying yes to opportunities, but it's about knowing which opportunities to say no to and not worrying too much about what the competition are doing. That can just be a distraction. Competitor comes up and says, oh, we're going to focus on this product. And then, and Kicker's experienced this, looking at the rugby program that we delivered and developed. I mean, there was a competitor that popped up, but I think if we had some of these tools, because we didn't have this business plan structure, we didn't have that until much later on in the business when we were really thinking about that exponential growth and taking it to a sale. And had we have had that earlier on to say, you know what, let's just not do rugby. Let's leave them to that space. But we didn't. We said yes, and we took on rugby, and it drew resources and time and money, and ultimately was not a success when we could have just said, forget what they're doing. Let's focus on what we do well, and what we do well